I'm here today on Island Focus with Avi Soifer, who is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Hawaii Richardson Law School. Mahalo for taking the time to be with us today, Avi.
Great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Would you explain to us a little bit more what that means to you as a professor, what that means to us, and why should it matter?
Well, I think free speech matters immensely, and this is a time when free speech is under attack more than one can remember for a long time. Some of the attack is, I think, justified, and we have to be careful when we just lump a lot of things under that label. So one of the reasons we're having problems now is that our leaders, our politicians, for example, seem to be using and abusing free speech in various ways, and they have some oomph behind it, and they also get attention readily. But the key thing about free speech is that it's for citizens primarily, and it's a duty, in my view, to be educated, to pay attention, and to be willing to express yourself. There's a lot of talk now about the dangers to democracy, and I think there are severe dangers right now. But people are mostly talking about the vote. And the vote is only the beginning. As a friend of mine puts it, it's the door. But then you get inside, and that's where there is an opportunity as well as a responsibility to use what we hope is good civic education, to be someone who speaks out when you see the need to speak out. So it's not a cacophony of voices, and it's not absolute. That's a mistake that people often make. There are restrictions. No one has ever said in the courts that there's an absolute right to free speech. A good example, people like to talk about shouting fire in a crowded theater. Nice. And Justice Holmes famously said that. First of all, he said that in the context of a case that restricted freedom of speech. So that's an important thing to know if you learn about the history of free speech. But he didn't say that exactly. He said, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a riot. So there's both more and less protection in the actual quote than shouting fire in a crowded theater. That you're not supposed to do. But of course, if there's a real fire in a crowded theater, you might want to say, hey, fire, folks. Let's in an orderly fashion go out, you hope you say next. So freedom of speech is not just a complete say whatever you want whenever you want it. And there are hurts that are imposed by freedom of speech. There's hate speech and so on. And so there have been restrictions all along in the constitutional development of freedom of speech.
Well, and freedom of speech and freedom of expression have been used interchangeably.
That's right.
Speaking is not just speaking, it's also action.
Yes, symbolic speech, for example. I went to the high school that in the Midwest that suspended students for wearing black armbands. Mm-hmm. They actually wore them to mourn all the dead in the Vietnam War, and this was pretty early in the Vietnam War, and they were kicked out because the school said, if you continue to wear those armbands, you'll be beaten up. Well, the Supreme Court ultimately, 4 years later, the war had changed, the protests had changed, said they had a right, this is U.S. Supreme Court, they had a right to wear those armbands. Those armbands were a form of expression, even though there are no words. And so it's the greatest victory for the rights of school children or young adults that has ever happened in the Supreme Court. They've cut it back ever since. But the name of the case is Tinker versus Des Moines Independent School District. My high school, my school district.
Who decides when something is not freedom of speech? I know you mentioned the Supreme Court in that particular case, but is it always decided in the legal profession?
Not always at all. And I think an important point is that there's local responsibility. And very few cases wind up in court at all, and many fewer wind up in the higher courts or in the U.S. Supreme Court. They're actually deciding about half as many decisions as were decided in the Warren Court. They're taking fewer cases. So your chances of getting the U.S. Supreme Court are very, very slim. And even if you go to state court or federal court, it's often the case that a case doesn't go to decision, that people settle. So once you know that about who decides legally, it becomes more of a responsibility for people on the ground, as it were. And just to say, oh, I have freedom of assembly, that doesn't win. You have to convince people, your neighbor perhaps. So you want to say, you can't tell me that I have to quarantine. Freedom of assembly. Well, it doesn't necessarily win. You can say that, and your neighbor might say, Yes, but that's endangering me. So there is free speech perhaps on both sides of that argument. And then there's another further depth to that about, does the state have the authority to tell you that for the public good, you have to quarantine?
Well, thank you so much for spending a little time with us and helping us to understand the broader interpretation and also the importance and the significance for us as citizens.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. Anytime. Good to see you.
Mahalo for joining us on Island Focus and meeting Avi Soifer, professor at the UH Richardson Law School. Mahalo.